I didn't notice her all at once. Not in the way you notice someone who bursts into a room, loud and certain of being seen. No, she was different. It was in the quiet grace of how she moved, the way she carried herself like she didn't need to demand attention. It simply arrived to her like moths to a lantern. The evening was already winding down when I first felt her presence. A soft glow from the dining room lamps fell over everyone, giving the whole place that warm, honey-colored light that makes conversations feel closer, more personal. People were scattered, some still talking in clusters, others leaning back in their chairs, tired but content. And then there was her. She stood near the corner of the table, her hand wrapped lightly around the stem of a glass. The smallest details caught me. The relaxed way her shoulders curved, the subtle elegance in the way she shifted her weight, as though she belonged perfectly to that space. She wasn't trying. She didn't have to. When she laughed at something someone said, it wasn't loud, but it carried. A rich, low sound, the kind of laugh that made me want to hear it again. Not because of what was said, but because it came from her. I told myself not to stare. But my eyes betrayed me, drifting back more than once. Every time, she seemed unaware, or maybe she wasn't. It was hard to tell. The first time she came close, it was nothing. She leaned forward to set her glass on the table, and in doing so, her sleeve brushed against my arm. Just fabric, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough to spark a current through me, sharp and electric, and then gone. I glanced at her, half expecting her to notice, to apologize. She didn't. Instead, she gave the faintest smile, as though she knew exactly what had passed between us. The smallest of accidents, or perhaps not an accident at all. I tried to anchor myself back in conversation with someone else, but I was aware of her in the room the way you're aware of a song playing low in the background. You can talk over it, you can pretend you're not listening, but it threads its way into you anyway. She carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence I wasn't used to. Not bold in the sense of trying to impress, but bold in her ease, in the comfort of someone who had lived enough to not second-guess every step. That was what drew me in, I think, the calm gravity of someone who didn't need to prove anything. And yet, under that confidence, there was something else. A subtle softness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, like a private vulnerability kept carefully tucked away. It made me want to know her story, to understand the layers behind the smile. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning, the spark before the flame. Later that night, after most of the noise had softened into a hum, I found myself standing by the kitchen doorway, half debating whether to leave or linger. The party had thinned out, people trickling away in twos and threes. Laughter drifted faintly from the living room, but here, near the low counter stacked with half-finished plates and a few empty glasses, it was quiet. And then she was there, not with a grand entrance, just a gentle crossing of the space, her presence filling it before I could even turn. She set her glass down on the counter beside mine, close enough that the rims touched. The sound was small, but in that silence, it was sharp enough to anchor me. "Looks like we're the last ones keeping this kitchen alive," she said, her voice steady, touched with something playful. I smiled, relieved she'd broken the moment first. "Someone has to guard the snacks." She laughed, not loudly, but enough to fill the air between us. A warm, rich laugh, unforced, like she gave herself fully to the sound. It loosened something in me. Our conversation began simply, the kind of small talk that hovers around weather, travel, and a mutual friend who had brought us here. But soon it shifted. She asked about the book I was holding, the one I'd brought almost absent-mindedly earlier that evening. And when I told her about it, she listened, not just politely, not with the half-distracted nod most people give when they're already planning their next sentence. No, she tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on me, as though she wanted to hear the exact shape of every word. That kind of listening does something to you. It makes you speak more carefully, but also more honestly. At one point, when I made a joke about my clumsy way of explaining things, she reached out, just briefly, and touched my forearm. Lightly. Her fingers rested there for less than a breath, but it was enough. Enough to send heat rushing up my skin, to make me hyper-aware of how close we stood, how the faint scent of her perfume curled between us. She didn't pull away quickly, either. She let her hand linger, as if testing the boundary between casual and intentional. My pulse betrayed me. I could feel it drumming against the place her hand had been. I tried to answer her question, something about the book's ending, but my voice faltered slightly. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because all I could think about was the way she was looking at me. Not in the way you look at a stranger at a party, not in the way you politely endure conversation. No, this was different. Her eyes held me longer than they should have, just long enough to say what her lips hadn't dared. It struck me then, I wasn't imagining this. Whatever it was mutual. Subtle, yes. Quiet, yes. But real. And in that kitchen, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of laughter from the other room, the night had changed. The night had thinned down to silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, a silence that seems to invite secrets. Most of the guests had left, their laughter and footsteps fading into the distance, leaving only a few dim lights glowing in the house. She and I drifted out together, almost by accident, almost as though we'd been pulled by the same invisible thread. The cool air outside wrapped around us. I shoved my hands into my pockets, less out of cold and more because I didn't quite know what else to do with them. She adjusted her scarf with that same graceful ease I'd noticed earlier, her movements unhurried, deliberate. For a while, we simply walked side by side. Our steps fell into rhythm without effort, the sound of our shoes tapping lightly against the quiet pavement. The world felt smaller, stripped down to just the glow of street lamps and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. I could feel her presence beside me in every small detail, the way her arms swayed naturally as she walked, brushing close enough that it occasionally grazed the sleeve of my coat. The fleeting contact was nothing more than fabric against fabric, but each time it happened, it lit something sharp and restless in me. I wondered if she noticed. There was a part of me that wanted to break the silence with words, to find some excuse for why my chest tightened every time she glanced in my direction. But another part of me knew that words would ruin it, that the silence was not empty. It was charged, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. At one point, I shifted slightly, close enough that our hands nearly touched. It wasn't deliberate, or at least that's what I told myself. But when her fingers drifted close, hovering at that dangerous space between contact and distance, I felt my pulse quicken. She didn't take her hand away. She let it remain there, just a breath away from mine, as if daring me to notice. And I did. Every nerve in my body noticed. Inside, I fought myself. Respect pulled one way, reminding me of the gap between us, of the way people might look at her and me, of the reasons I should let the night end without crossing that invisible line. But desire pulled the other way, not a reckless desire, but something quieter, deeper, the kind that grows not from impulse, but from recognition, from the sense that this was no accident. I stole a glance at her. Her profile was softened by the lamplight, her eyes looking straight ahead, but her lips curved ever so slightly, as though she carried some secret thought she wasn't ready to share. The space between us was almost unbearable in its closeness. Not far enough to be strangers, not near enough to be anything else. It was a fragile, suspended moment, one step away from breaking, one breath away from changing everything. And still we walked, slowly, quietly, side by side, both of us pretending it was nothing while knowing it was everything. By the time we reached the end of the street, the night felt like it was holding its breath. A single lamppost glowed at the corner, casting a circle of pale light onto the pavement. It wasn't bright, just enough to soften the edges of everything. Her features, the lines of her scarf, the quiet rise and fall of her chest as she stood across from me. We stopped there, as if by unspoken agreement. Neither of us seemed ready to say goodbye. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It was thick, full of everything unsaid. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that I wondered if she could hear it. I searched for words, for some clever remark to make the moment lighter, easier. But nothing came. Nothing felt right. And then she moved. It was subtle at first, the way she shifted her weight, the way her eyes found mine and held there. I expected her to look away, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped closer, slow and deliberate, her gaze steady as though she was testing whether I'd flinch. I didn't. I couldn't. Her hand rose, unhurried, until her fingers found my wrist. The touch was gentle, almost cautious, but sure enough to send a jolt through me. Her skin was warm against mine, her grip light but certain, like she was reminding me that this wasn't a question. This was an answer neither of us had spoken. Without a word, she tugged, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to erase the space that had kept us apart all evening. The world around us faded. The faint hum of a distant car, the whisper of wind through the trees, it all blurred into the background. All I felt was her. The nearness of her body, the steady rhythm of her breath, the soft brush of her scarf against my coat as the last inches between us disappeared. I didn't resist. How could I? Every unspoken glance, every brush of her hand, every silence we'd shared had led to this moment. Resisting would have been a lie. Up close, I could see details I hadn't noticed before. The faint line at the corner of her mouth, the softness in her eyes that contradicted the confident way she carried herself. She wasn't smiling, not exactly, but her expression carried something deeper. A question, maybe, or an invitation. My pulse quickened under her fingertips where she still held my wrist. I didn't move, afraid that if I did, the moment would scatter like dust in the wind. So I stayed there, letting her closeness sink into me, letting the silence speak for us both. There was no need for words. She had pulled me closer, and in that stillness, in that fragile space where hesitation melted into something more, I knew everything had changed. Time seemed to stretch, thin the moment she pulled me closer. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of thing you'd see in a film with music swelling and fireworks exploding. It was quieter than that, smaller, yet it felt bigger than anything I'd experienced in a long while. Her hand stayed at my wrist, fingers resting with a kind of ease that told me she wasn't second-guessing herself. But I was. Not because I wanted to step back, but because my mind couldn't keep up with what my heart already knew. I thought about the gap between us, the years, the way people might raise their eyebrows, the questions they'd never say aloud but we'd both hear all the same. That hesitation flared up inside me, sharp and familiar. But it only lasted a breath, because then I felt it, the warmth of her palm against my skin, the steady quiet of her nearness. And suddenly, the noise in my head began to fade. I looked down at her hand, at the way it held me without claiming me, steady but unpossessive. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something achingly tender. I let my own hand shift, turning just slightly, until my fingers brushed against hers. The contact was small, barely more than skin grazing skin, but the effect was instant. A quiet pulse ran through me, grounding me to her. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. Up close, her gaze carried something I hadn't seen earlier in the night. Vulnerability. A question she wasn't speaking aloud, as if she was waiting to see whether I'd meet her halfway. And I did. I didn't resist. I let my body relax into hers, leaning in the slightest fraction until the space between us no longer held its sharp edge. The hesitation that had held me back for hours softened, giving way to acceptance. This wasn't reckless. It wasn't rushed. It felt inevitable. Her other hand rose then, almost cautiously, until it rested against my chest. Not pressing, just there, warm and steady, like she was measuring the beat of my heart beneath her fingertips. I felt it quicken, pounding hard against her palm, and I wondered if she realized how much power that small gesture carried. I steadied my breath, matching it to hers, slow, deliberate in rhythm. And in that rhythm, something inside me settled. It was as if the night had conspired to bring us here. The silence, the lingering glances, the accidental touches that weren't accidents at all. Everything had led to this moment, this quiet surrender where neither of us needed to explain a thing. I didn't speak. She didn't either. There was no need. Words would only have broken the spell, and neither of us wanted that. Instead, I let go of the last of my hesitation and gave myself to the closeness to her. And in that silence, in that fragile, tender space, I realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. For a long moment, we simply stood there, suspended between what had been and what was about to be. Her hand still rested against my chest, steady, grounding, her touch quiet but sure. I could feel the heat of her palm even through the layers of my coat, and it was as if she had placed her hand not on my body, but directly on my heartbeat itself. I don't know what gave me the courage, but I lifted my arms, slow and careful, as though afraid that one wrong move would shatter the fragile spell we'd woven around ourselves. She didn't step back. She didn't hesitate. Instead, when my arms circled her, she slipped into them as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. It wasn't a hurried embrace. There was nothing desperate in it. It was deliberate, unspoken, and impossibly tender. Her body fit against mine in a way that felt natural, inevitable. She leaned her cheek gently against my shoulder, and for the first time that night, I closed my eyes. Her hair brushed along my jawline, soft, carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. A warm, subtle scent that felt like it belonged to the night itself. I breathed it in without meaning to, and it settled deep inside me, anchoring me. I tightened my arms around her, not in possession, but in reassurance, as if to tell her without words, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She responded with the smallest shift, a subtle press of her cheek against me, a deepening of the closeness that made my chest ache in the best possible way. The world outside of us seemed to fall away. The hum of distant traffic, the coolness of the night air, even the dim lamplight, all of it faded into background. All I was aware of was her warmth against me, the steadiness of her breath, the gentle rise and fall of her chest where it met mine. There's something about an embrace that says more than words ever could. A hug can be casual, fleeting, polite. But this wasn't that. This was a choice. A moment where two people surrendered the distance between them and trusted that it was safe to be seen, to be held. I felt her hand shift slightly, sliding from my chest up to the curve of my shoulder, fingers resting there as though she needed that anchor just as much as I did. And for a brief, suspended moment, I thought, if time stopped right here, I wouldn't mind. It wasn't passion that overwhelmed me, but peace. A deep, quiet peace that wrapped itself around us both, telling me this was where I was meant to be. In her arms, with the night holding us, the silence protecting us, and the warmth between us speaking for everything we couldn't yet say. Eventually, we loosened our embrace, though neither of us seemed eager to let go entirely. She stepped back just a little, enough to look at me, her hands still resting lightly against my arms. The lamplight caught the faint curve of her lips, not quite a smile, more like the echo of one, subtle, private, as though it belonged to just us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Words felt clumsy compared to the quiet conversation we just had through touch alone. But in her eyes, I saw everything I needed, the steadiness, the softness, and a trace of vulnerability that told me this hadn't been easy for her either. I searched for something to say, something simple that could hold the weight of what had just happened. But she was the one who saved me. "You should probably get going," she whispered, her voice warm but quiet, as though she didn't really want me to. "Probably," I said, but I didn't move. We stood there in that delicate space, close enough to feel the warmth still lingering between us, far enough that the night could pretend we were just two people saying goodnight. And then, before the moment could slip away, she leaned in. Not quickly, not urgently, just a slow, deliberate tilt forward until her lips found my cheek. The kiss was soft, almost weightless, but it lingered long enough that I could feel the warmth of it even after she pulled back. My breath caught, not because it was unexpected, but because it felt like the most natural conclusion to a night I hadn't seen coming. A gift, quiet and unwrapped, placed gently in my hands. When she stepped back, her eyes lingered on mine a heartbeat longer, as if to make sure I understood that this wasn't a mistake, that whatever had begun tonight was real. I nodded, not in answer to any spoken question, but in recognition of what had passed between us. She reached for her keys, her movements calm, unhurried, and I took a small step back, giving her space. But the moment clung to me, the faint trace of her perfume still in the air, the ghost of her lips still warm against my skin. "Good night," she said softly, her voice carrying both an ending and a promise. "Good night," I echoed, my own voice lower than usual, as though I was afraid to disturb the stillness that had settled around us. I turned then, walking slowly down the quiet street. Each step felt different, lighter somehow, as though the night had handed me something I hadn't realized I was missing. I couldn't help the small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Not a grin, not obvious, but the quiet kind that comes when you know something has changed, something you don't yet have words for, but you feel all the same. She had pulled me closer without a word, and I hadn't resisted.